Welcome to chapter 4, in which we're going to study relative clauses, so when a whole clause completes the head noun. These are our goals for this chapter, so you should be able to spot relative clauses in a text, describe them by spotting the antecedent of a relative clause, giving the function of the relative pronoun, account for, which means to explain, the choice of the relative pronoun, and tell whether the relative is restrictive or non-restrictive. Finally, you should be able to use relative pronouns correctly and translate the French dont. So here's the layout, and we're going to start with a definition. And as usual, we're going to start with an example. So we have seen relative clauses before last semester when we talked about noun phrase structure and you learned about post-modification. Remember, you had a choice between prepositional phrases and relative clauses. Well, we studied prepositional phrases in chapter 3, and guess what? Chapter 4 is about relative clauses. So here is an example. Sorry. Darth Vader is a Jedi who would do anything to gain more power. So we have a noun phrase between brackets here. We know the limits are here because we can replace the whole noun phrase by a pronoun. Remember, this is the pronoun test from last semester. So you could say, for example, Darth Vader is that. The pronoun that replaces the entire noun phrase. So you know it starts with a Jedi and stops with more power. You could also use the function test to mark the limits of the noun phrase. So what is the function of a Jedi who would do anything to gain more power? It is the predicative complement of the verb is, predicative complement, attribut du sujet, remember. So let's concentrate on this noun phrase, shall we? So you know the drill. There are 4 set spots or slots or places in the noun phrase. You start with the determination to tell you how the reference is built. You continue with what comes between determination and the noun head. It's called premodification. Then you have the head, which is a noun in the noun phrase. And then you can have something that post-modifies that head, which is called post-modification. So here you have the determiner a. The head is Jedi, and the post-modification is, of course, who would do anything to gain more power. There is no question, it would not make sense to say a Jedi who would do anything and then a Jedi to gain more power. So you understand that to gain more power is the end of the same post-modification, really. There's only one post-modification. Okay, so now if we want to complete the noun phrase structure, there is a line missing, a line that gives the category each word or group of words belong to. So remember, is the indefinite article. You need to be very precise. Jedi is actually a proper noun. It's a made-up noun, but it's proper noun. And of course, the past modification is a relative clause. Okay? So this is what we're going to study, and we'll dig a little deeper than last time, in last semester, and see how it works and what goes on inside the relative clause. So first, I'd like to insist on the fact that the last line here gives you the category, la nature. Category means nature, that each word or group of words belongs to. But at this stage, I would like to add the function of the relative clause, what it is doing in the noun phrase. Well, it completes the noun Jedi. So it is a noun complement as well. So yes, you notice that it has the same function as the prepositional phrases we studied in noun complements in chapter 3. Okay, because the job of past modification in a noun phrase is to complete the noun, really. So it's the same function. So we're ready now to give a definition of a relative clause. It is a subordinate clause that post-modifies and completes a noun head. You want, of course, to write this down and memorize it by heart. You need to be able to define a relative clause, but you should also be able to understand what it really means. So we'll have a short recap on a few words used here. First, the word clause. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure that you know the French equivalent. A sentence is une phrase in French. A sentence starts with a capital letter and ends with a full stop, un point. It is a semantic unit. We'll get back to that, but basically it means that it makes sense. It stands alone as a semantic unit. Don't confuse phrase in English, which is un groupe, like noun phrase, and sentence. Then you have the word clause. A clause is une proposition. Make sure you write proposition, not préposition. Préposition, preposition, that's a small grammatical word that is meant to locate reference geographically or in time, for instance, like in, or, under, above, etc. It can also express different things like cause, purpose, etc. But don't confuse it with a proposition, clause. So a proposition, a clause if you want, is a group of words organized around a verb. Okay, a clause is a group of words organized around a verb. Then you can differentiate the main clause from the subordinate. So main clause proposition principale, subordinate clause proposition subordonnée. We'll come back to that. So let's try to illustrate these differences with examples. Okay, so you have to determine what the words in red are. So there is a small dialogue. I love you. What a surprise. Okay. More than one answer may be acceptable. Take a moment to think about what a surprise can be. And here comes the answer. Actually, it's two things. First, it is a sentence because it starts with a capital letter and it ends with, well, here, an exclamation mark. Okay? It is also a semantic unit. It makes sense on its own. But it is also a noun phrase as it is structured around the noun surprise, which is the head. It's actually what we call an exclamative phrase, as it starts with the pronoun what and ends with an exclamation mark. Mind you, it is not an exclamative clause. It's a phrase, okay? It's organized around a noun, not around a verb. Okay, let's try again. It can look complicated, but try to think. So the words in red, okay, are what? Take a moment, and here goes the answer. All right, here the only proposition that was acceptable is a sentence. It's an utterance, an énoncé, but it's not a noun phrase because okay is not a noun. It is an interjection, okay, like yes or hello, for instance. We still don't know what a clause is, but we're getting there. Okay, what about this one? Seriously. That should be pretty easy. Seriously is an adverb, so it cannot be a noun phrase. There is no verb, so it cannot be a clause, therefore it's just a sentence, okay? A small one, but it starts with a capital letter and ends with an exclamation mark, so it's called an adverbial phrase, okay? A phrase organized around one adverb. Okay, let's continue this time. The words in red are, I love you, I know, says Harrison Ford. I know. Okay, so you're starting to get it. So it cannot be a noun phrase, can it? You have a conjugated verb. So here we're getting closer to, yes, a sentence. It starts with a capital letter and it ends with a full stop. But it's also, this time, a clause, okay? It contains a verb. The presence of a verb makes it a clause, all right? So that's the main indication. So now we need to know the difference between a main clause and a subordinate clause. And before we do, a short point on relative clause again. So remember, it's the definition. A relative clause is not just a clause, it's a subordinate clause, which means that you have to make the difference between subordinate and main clause. Okay, so here it goes. When there is one verb in a sentence, then you can tell that it is made of one clause, like in this example. She finally told him the truth. There is only one verb, okay? It's one clause. But sometimes the sentence gets more complex and there is a second verb in the sentence, like in, she told him that she was in love. Okay, you have two verbs in bold characters, told and was, so you have two clauses this time. Okay, but in that case, this is what we call a complex sentence, okay? Une phrase complexe, a complex sentence, because there is a hierarchical relationship. Hierarchical relationship, une relation hiérarchique, make sure you write hierarchical properly and you pronounce it properly. So there is a hierarchical relationship between the two clauses. One is the boss and one is not the boss. The boss, as you can guess, is the main clause, and the other one is the subordinate clause, okay? Subordinate means it is under, it's inferior, okay? Like a boss and a subordinate. Well, you don't say subordinate in English, but in French you have un subordonné au travail, okay? Well, the subordinate is not the boss, is it? So here, the whole sentence is the main clause, and the subordinate clause is embedded within the main clause. It's the section in green. So how do I know it's the subordinate? Because I can only analyze it in relation to the main clause. The subordinate is in fact the direct object of the verb told, the verb of the main sentence. She finally told him what? She told him that she was in love. That she was in love is the object of told. Okay? This is important because sometimes you can have two clauses that are just coordinated, but they're on the same level, okay? She, for example, she finally told him the truth and she left. And she left is coordinated with the first clause, but it's still, there are two on the same level. One is not subordinate to the other, okay? So this works only with subordinate clause. So, a definition you can memorize and write down, of course, if you want to understand the difference between main and subordinate clause, is that the main clause governs the subordinate clause. The subordinate clause gets its function from the main clause. So let's practice a little bit. Again, let's turn to our words in red. Let's see if you get it. So let's do it together. I know that you do. So answer one is not possible, as you can clearly see that there are two verbs. I know that you do, okay? Answer number two does not work, actually, as we are looking at the words in red only. Make sure you read the instructions carefully, okay? It would work if you had the whole sentence in red. So you see that there is a main clause and a subordinate, but which is which? Okay, this is what we're left with. So if you remember what we said earlier, we said that a subordinate clause works in relation to the main clause. So let's see if that is the case. I know what? That you do. So clearly, that you do is a subordinate clause, which is the direct object of the verb know. Is it a relative clause? Clearly no, as a relative clause always completes a noun. Okay, remember that. Okay, one more time. The words in red are I love you, your problem. Okay, so here again, take a look at the words in red. There is no verb, so you can already eradicate main clause and subordinate clause. You're left with sentence and noun phrase. Well, it is a sentence as it starts with a capital letter, ends with an exclamation mark, and it's a semantic unit, but it's also clearly a noun phrase. Problem is the head determined by the possessive determiner your. What about this one now? I'm not the guy that you think. Okay, take a moment. Really trying to do the exercise before I give the answer. And yes, it is a complex sentence. You've got two verbs this time. The whole sentence is in red. So it's just a complex sentence made of a main clause and a subordinate clause, but well, the words in red are most of all a complex sentence. Okay, now let's zoom on that you think. Again, take your time. What is that? Well, clearly it's not a complex sentence this time because it was the previous slide. So is it a subordinate clause, a relative clause, or a noun phrase? Okay. So clearly a noun phrase is not a possible answer because you have a verb. It's not organized around a noun. So subordinate and relative, well actually it's both, isn't it? Because relative is a subordinate. It is a subordinate clause because it completes the noun guy. Okay, it's the complement of the noun guy. I am not the guy that you think. Let's continue with this one. I will love you when you grow some hair. Okay, take a moment because it's a bit more complex. It's the first time we see a clause starting with when. Okay, so you have two verbs. So you may be tempted to see it as a complex sentence, but it's not, because again, we are looking at the words in red only. So yes, it is a subordinate clause, but is it a relative? Normally, a relative clause immediately follows the noun it completes, but here it comes after the pronoun you, so it's a first clue. Plus the pronoun is a little unusual. It's when, okay, not who. After you, you would expect a pronoun, a relative pronoun like who or whom or whose maybe. So this is actually what we call the time complement, okay? A time complement, not an adverbial, okay, but a time complement. Well, it's actually an adverbial also. You could remove it or change its place, okay? You could start with, when you grow some hair, I will love you. So it's what we call une proposition subordonnée circonstancielle de temps in French, okay? So relative clauses are not time complements, they are noun complements. So they don't work here. This is just a subordinate clause, okay? An adverbial subordinate clause. We'll talk about it in a minute. So you're ready for activity 4.1 on eCampus, in which you will have to determine whether a segment in a sentence is a clause, a sentence, a main clause, a subordinate, or a relative. So basically practice what we've just been doing.